We're a small crowd, but we will be mighty. Thank you. I can.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Let's start here. My name is Mylène Simard, and I am an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the original traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Niniwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered together tonight to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Monday Rent Boy by Susan Doherty. It's a bravely imagined, deeply empathetic novel of two adolescent boys bound by friendship and a terrible secret. We're grateful to Random House Canada for publishing this volume and for arranging this celebratory evening. Following a reading and a presentation from the author, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you are watching from home, feel free to type your question in our chat. I will do my best to pass it along to our writer. And if you're here in the room, just raise your hand. I will approach you with a microphone so everybody can hear you. I'll be back at the close of the event to review signing procedure. But before then, author Susan Doherty's award-winning novel, A Secret Music, was followed 4 years later by The Ghost Garden, which is available here as well, the biography of a woman living with schizophrenia. She has worked on staff for Maclean's and freelance for the International Herald Tribune, La Tribune de Genève, and The Independent in London. For 18 years, she ran her own advertising production company. She has served on the boards of the Royal Conservatory of Music, the Quebec Writers' Federation, and Nazareth House, a home for those afflicted by addiction and homelessness. Since 2009, she has volunteered at the Douglas Institute, a psychiatric hospital, working with people living with severe mental illness. She is married to the educator Hal Hannaford. Please join me in welcoming Susan Doherty.
Thank you so much for coming. The Globe and Mail recently wrote an article praising McNally Robinson's status as a beloved local institution with a clear mission statement. Books have to be the greatest, biggest, and only focus. Coupled with their passion for promoting authors, it is a thrill to be back in Winnipeg. Thank you, Mylène, for that introduction. So in 2018, I stood at this very podium trembling with nerves. My voice quivered as I recounted the medical marvels performed by the doctors and nurses at the Jewish General and the Royal Victoria Hospitals in Montreal. They were the guardians who rescued me from the clutches of a rare blood disorder with a 60-day window to death that threatened to consume me. My treatment included a stem cell transplant. When I stood here, my legs felt as sturdy as 2 stalks of parsley. My heart pounded with gratitude and awe at the miraculous power of human intervention. This book is dedicated to William Ashby Hall, my stem cell donor. Without him, there would be no book. With time, I came to see that my survival was somehow predicated on probing the darkest recesses of humanity to lift certain subjects a little closer to the light. And so I bring another difficult topic to the page. I've decided that for my next book, I will be writing about the many uses of dryer lint or the riveting history of office supplies, and I'll try my best to make it a page turner. My last book, The Ghost Garden, was a deep dive into the world of schizophrenia, a highly misunderstood and stigmatized mental illness. This time, I chose to write a novel about the sexual predation of children, the lucrative aspects of buying and selling pornography on the dark net, and the devastation left in the wake of crimes against our youngest members of society. But more importantly, it's a story about the heartfelt friendship between 2 teenage boys who keep a secret, Arthur W. Barnes and Ernie Castlefrank. They're lovable bad guys, verging on semi-degeneracy, but you root for them anyway, because as the reader, your own empathy for children who have suffered an injustice will shape your perspective. You may not be able to fully forgive them, but hopefully you will understand the chaos of their adult lives. At its core, Monday Rent Boy is a literary mystery about the magnificence of friendship. It's about vulnerability, family secrecy, shame, and divided loyalties. It's about mentorship and the fallout of being a bystander. Above all, it's about resilience, a trait that is learned rather than inherited. No one is born resilient. Well, maybe there is a tiny nature-nurture component that gives people a leg up, the capacity to overcome strife or trauma, but I believe it comes from the presence of having at least one stable and committed relationship. Someone who can provide a scaffolding to buffer a child from developmental destruction. It's called human connection. Resilience increases a person's capacity to bounce back from adversity. I did wonder, is it even possible to bounce back from chronic child abuse when your innocence has been stolen and the hole that's left behind is filled with shame and a lack of trust for future relationships? And maybe in the hole there's a 40-ouncer of vodka or a bottle of OxyContin and thoughts about whether the light fixture can hold your weight. Tough stuff. But resilience has a dark side. Though undeniably valuable, resilience can inadvertently normalize detestable behavior, especially when extreme situations become routine, thus blurring the gravity of the situation at hand. It's a coping mechanism that masquerades as resilience and allows a person to endure ongoing hardship. It's called resignation. An even worse outcome of unaddressed abuse is that empathy for others is compromised. In my novel, I look at the distinguishing factors that might help a person overcome trauma versus the situations that might crush another. In other words, who rises from trauma and who succumbs to it. I did dozens of interviews with victims of child exploitation. Their candidness was both disarming and a confirmation of the importance of addressing abuse. A 50-year-old man shared that he was a key member of a children's theater company in Minneapolis. In order to secure a lead role, he explained, it was expected that the boys would offer sexual favors to the founder and director of the company. A 30-year-old man spoke to me about being groomed and molested at a prestigious summer camp in New England. His father was chairman of the board, which stopped him from stepping forward. He was 11 when it all began. A 70-year-old man told me he was raped by a priest, and a year after that, he had a 3-year relationship with a nun. He told me she was his only true love. He was 12, she was 46. In a breezy, matter-of-fact way, he also said he's blown through 4 marriages and has slept with hundreds of women. I will let you make your own conclusions about what he was trying to navigate or shake off or compensate for. These 3 men were the boys who crawled into their adult selves with addiction, drugs, alcohol, sex. My task as a writer was to find a way to tell their stories because they often don't have the stomach to tell it themselves. They did all find lasting comfort when the weight of their stories was loosened from their chests. It's crucial to recognize that many survivors, regardless of gender, still struggle to find it safe enough to speak out. The average man waits at least 20 years to come forward. Most stay in the shadows, which makes it impossible to quantify the true number of men and women adversely affected who didn't have the opportunity or courage to speak up. There were 2 common strands to all the stories I gathered. Everyone had been groomed. Grooming is the process of building trust and an emotional connection with a potential victim to manipulate and exploit them, often for the purpose of sexual abuse. And the second strand was that everyone had some form of addiction, not all of them unhealthy. One man who shared his story has run 42 marathons. But the big question on everyone's lips when I first began to research this topic was, why go there? Why venture into such dark territory when there are countless other stories to explore that are less fraught with discomfort and even revulsion? The short answer is that after completing the first draft, I was taken aback to discover a common theme running through all of my books: a focus on children in adverse situations. A Secret Music, The Ghost Garden, and now Monday Rent Boy. What holds paramount importance for me is tracing the trajectory of the injured child as he or she navigates the journey towards adulthood. And what does that path look like? The more urgent answer to the question of why write a book like this, I came to see that it needed to be written and hopefully read. Certain subjects are simply off the table. This is one of them. The very first iteration of this book was an exploration of temptation. What tempts us to do good deeds versus what leads us astray to commit acts of evil? Moreover, do our experiences nudge us toward one direction or the other? Are we born with our values, or are they shaped by the cues and responses we receive from other people? The theme of temptation was a trampoline through a portal I could never have envisioned. As a researcher, I went to some very desperate places. It was a comfort to tell myself that at any time I could walk away from this project. And did I have nightmares and sweaty dreams and big doubts? Yes, I did. But the more I plowed forward, the more resolute I became. And that's when I met Patrick. He has an aversion to drinking chocolate milk. The smell evokes an association with the pastor of his former church, underscoring the enduring impact of our negative past experiences. He suffers from PTSD. Years and even decades have passed, and the scent of chocolate milk is still causing a pain somewhere in his body and mind. Maybe both. The body is the storage locker for our emotions. Buried emotions often manifest as physical symptoms. I spent a very long time wondering what demon had been sewn into the seam of Patrick's soul. From there, I began to weave fragments of interviews into fiction, always mindful of respecting the privacy of those who had bravely shared their stories of shame, confusion, and even moments of complicity. Interestingly enough, as I was preparing my talk for tonight, I was also reading Tom Lake, a stunning novel my friend Colette Connor described as taking a warm bath or being wrapped in a cashmere blanket. Somehow, I don't write cashmere blanket stories. My goal was to write a novel about sex abuse, the grooming and manipulation of innocent children, and self-destruction, and leave the reader feeling optimistic. I know, easy, right? It meant that I had to take every opportunity to lighten the batter and make the story as readable as possible. My hope is that you will love my characters as much as I do. Arthur Barnes and Ernie Castlefrank fail forward, looking for their power in the broken places in order to regain trust, feel love, laugh, and thrive. Quirky fictional outsiders who fight authority and injustice are my favorite book characters. Think of Atticus Finch, Robin Hood, Miss Havisham, Jean Valjean. It's their flaws that make them so relatable and endearing. Either you have a superpower like Batman and you save the world, or you're an ordinary child facing an extraordinary challenge like Matilda, or in my case, Arthur Barnes and Ernie Castlefrank, boys who needed to figure out how to save themselves from the most punishing moments without growing up and succumbing to the weight of a burdened adulthood. I want you to remember that sexual abuse persists because it's hard to talk about. It therefore thrives in silence, leaving children nowhere to turn. Damaged children become damaged adults, and the cycle of unearned disadvantage continues. Which brings me around to the Catholic Church. At the outset, I reached out to a friend, Monsignor Frederick Dolan, the vicar for Opus Dei in Canada. He's tall, dark, and impossibly handsome. You know, he might be from Central Casting. I went for coffee at his lovely Montreal residence and bravely asked for the names of abusive priests. He did not have any to offer, but he said he knew someone who could help. Monsignor Dolan contacted Bishop Thomas Dowd and arranged for a meeting. Shortly thereafter, walking through a downpour that served as a backdrop to my sense of unease, I climbed the steps to the bishop's office. As I hung out my coat in an armoire, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the two meeting rooms before me. The first was opulent, mahogany velvet, stained glass windows, a setting where I could envision Pope Frank having a glass or two of grappa. In contrast, the second room was a small white box furnished with nothing but two wooden benches, reminiscent of a place where Cinderella might have lived. As Bishop Dowd and I convened in the austere setting on those two hard benches, I couldn't shake the feeling that he harbored suspicions about my intentions as a journalist. Yet despite my initial apprehension and his, over the course of several hours, we engaged in a deep and meaningful discussion about my research. And then Bishop Dowd uttered these words: "Susan, whatever turns up, tell the truth. Do not shield the Catholic Church. They don't deserve it. They had no plan." We were even able to share that the hypocritical stance against homosexual relationships, the abuse of clerical power, and the betrayal of trust has left many congregants questioning their faith or walking away from Catholicism altogether. With an affirmation from the bishop, I never looked back. Months after that fateful first meeting on the wooden benches, Bishop Dowd took the stand in a Montreal courtroom as a witness for the prosecution in the Father Brian Boucher case. Boucher had been accused of sexual assault over a 20-year period and was transferred to 10 different Quebec churches. Bishop Dowd shared a 250-page report with the police. Soon after, Brian Boucher was sent to a federal penitentiary, and Bishop Dowd was sent to a new ministry somewhere near Sault Ste. Marie. In the Catholic Church, transfers, it seems, happen for all kinds of reasons. But as I researched what might have happened to one of my characters, who was completely bereft of adult support except from his abusers, I followed the trail to another more insidious consequence of the church's abuse scandal. The decades of cover-up combined with the rise of the dark web empowered abuse and networks of abusers far beyond the orbit of the church, creating a nightmarish proliferation of child abuse content on the internet and on darknet browsers like Tor, Freenet, and I2P. Adding the ability of customers to make anonymous payments with cryptocurrency, and the worldwide welfare of children has never been so precarious. I was looking at two parallel worlds, the Catholic Church and the darknet, two places where children were unsafe. The common denominator was secrecy. This is the puzzle I was piecing together as I wrote the first draft of Monday Rent Boy. If you tolerate something, it proliferates. While the Catholic Church did not condone sexual abuse or create a pathway to the darknet, of course not. Its tolerance through willful blindness led to a devastating consequence. When faced with the chance to influence over 1.3 billion members, they prioritized protecting the institution. The grim outcome? A rampant state where children are targeted, manipulated, and exploited for personal gain on the internet, deep web, and darknet. It's a situation that any organization, including the Boy Scouts and Hollywood, would find devastating to bear even 1 teaspoon of responsibility for. When I began the long years of research for Monday Rent Boy, I had plenty of sordid company. Hollywood's Harvey Weinstein. Johnny Kitagawa molested hundreds of boys as the titan of a music company that recruited singers for boy bands in Japan. Larry Nassar, the predator gymnastics coach. Jeffrey Epstein. The Boy Scouts filed for Chapter 11 as they processed sexual abuse claims to the tune of $2.46 billion. Benjamin Faulkner, a Canadian from Ontario, and Patrick Faulty from Tennessee were running an empire on the darknet called the Gift Box Exchange. The gift was children, and the exchange was photography and videos of depravity that would defy your imagination. But there was one story I followed with a magnifying glass. Jimmy Savile, a beloved BBC entertainer who was knighted by Queen Elizabeth at the behest of Margaret Thatcher for his philanthropy in foster homes and children's hospitals. His legacy in Britain was so profound that upon his death, he was buried in a golden coffin. The accolades were effusive. The engraving on his headstone was self-chosen. It read, "It was good while it lasted." Posthumously, it was revealed that in the span of 50 years, he had abused over 1,000 children. An even bigger crime, people knew. Saville was probably laughing up his sleeve that his behavior was tolerated year after year, decade after decade. Everyone knew it was wrong. The children, the adults, the executives, Jimmy himself. Why didn't anybody stop him? Jimmy Saville was the inspiration for the most despicable character in Monday Rent Boy. This long list of transgressors comprises men in positions of power who used their influence for self-gratification. When you finish page 1, which opens with a confrontation between Arthur W. Barnes and Marina Phillips, the owner of a quaint little bookshop in Glastonbury, you might wonder how a girl from the Montreal suburbs ends up writing a book situated in the southwest of England. And is that a hotbed of abuse? No, not at all. Abuse is everywhere, from Nunavut in Canada's far north, to Munster in Germany, to Queensland, Australia. My choice of location was completely serendipitous. I had begun my work with an exploration of temptation, and so I studied the ideas of Dostoevsky and Oscar Wilde and C.S. Lewis. Much more mundane was that Google took me to the Garden of Eden and Eve's offer of an apple, the introduction of original sin, but also free will. My next online inquiry aimed to discern the significance of apples. Soon enough, I was facing a very long list of apple varieties: Cortland, Granny Smith, Macintosh, Orange Pippin, Honeycrisp, and there was one obscure variety called Arthur W. Barnes. Voila! Arthur W. Barnes would be my main character caught up in a tangled crisis of temptation. And where are these Arthur W. Barnes apples cultivated? In Somerset, England, in the tiny town of Glastonbury, which was called in ancient times the Isle of Avalon, the Isle of Apples. Incidentally, I never intended to stay in England. I always planned to bring my story to Canada. But another more extraordinary coincidence was revealed that kept me in England. The focal point of Glastonbury is a UNESCO heritage site in the center of town known as the Tor. It's a prominent natural landmark that rises dramatically from the surrounding flat landscape. It's the image on the cover of the book. At its summit lie the ruins of a 13th century Catholic church. All that remains is the roofless St. Michael's Tower. My character, Ernie Castlefrank, claims that this tower marks the spot where the veil between our world and the next is thinnest. And here lies the synchronicity. The Tor in Glastonbury is not only a geographical reference, but also shares its name with the first darknet browser, also called Tor, an acronym for the Onion Router, a downloadable browser much like Chrome or Safari that was originally created by the US Navy to anonymously transmit classified intelligence worldwide. It quickly evolved into an unregulated domain catering to buyers and sellers seeking to conceal their transactions: drugs, guns, money laundering, child pornography. The Tor is a hub for illicit activities. Arthur W. Barnes, the Isle of Avalon, the Tor. My story could only unfold in Glastonbury, Somerset, in the United Kingdom. I did download the Tor browser so I could be part of the underworld for 24 hours, just enough time to understand how IP addresses are scrambled and bounced to servers around the world to create anonymity for buyers and sellers. I had so many worries that the FBI would come to my door with a battering ram of police officers, because believe me, I'm no detective. I sleep with the hall light on. After writing the second draft, my incredible husband and I traveled to the UK with a purpose to do field research in Somerset. We went to every town mentioned in the book: Bristol, Bath, Crewkerne, the cinema in Bridgewater, the juvenile courthouse in Taunton, Glastonbury, of course, mostly driving on impossibly narrow one-lane roads that are somehow referred to as the dual carriageway. With my husband Hal behind the wheel, I mostly kept my eyes closed, hoping we were the sole inhabitants in all of England, as the hedges scraped the paint off our rental car right down to the frame. Despite those heart-stopping moments and speed limits reminiscent of the German Autobahn, the trip was unforgettable. Hal found the perfect apple orchard rimmed with sycamores, and we discovered a secluded playground complete with creaky swings and ominous shadowy trees. We even saw a young teenager on the swings who had an uncanny resemblance to the Ernie I had envisioned. He happily let me take his photo, leapt off the swing at the high point, and offered to star in the movie version. Our journey was punctuated by so many moments of shiver-inducing synchronicity, so much so that by the fifth day, Hal woke up, turned to me and said, "I wonder what's going to happen to us today." On another note, I was deeply moved by the works of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Colson Whitehead, in particular, The Nickel Boys, not because his themes overlap with mine, rather it was his ability to handle a distressing subject matter without succumbing to sentimentality. He is, above all, a storyteller. So that was my template. My mission was to lead both my characters and you, the reader, down yet another shadowy path while still illuminating the way forward. The glue-like bond between Arthur and Ernie, forged in the fires of hardship and buried secrets, remained steadfast, defying distance and time to showcase the ultimate power of facing our past. What became evident was that although certain wounds might never fully vanish, they could be transformed into wellsprings of strength and perseverance, what I call the gift of trauma, a tomorrow brimming with potential and optimism. And of course, a story like this must have hope and love. To close, I was determined to open my own eyes and write a novel that would help others open theirs. So thank you very much for being here. And if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. Any questions?
So it's a good thing. Would you like to do a smaller reading from from your book?
Sure. I could just do like a quick little read.
Okay, perfect. And then we'll move on to signing afterwards.
Perfect. This is a little excerpt that takes place in Ernie's backyard. He's an animal lover and lives in a tumble-down house with taped-up windows situated beside the railway tracks. It's from Arthur's perspective, and Arthur is Ernie's best friend. The book is written in three voices, Arthur, Ernie, and then the bookseller, Marina Phillips. That Sunday afternoon, we were taking in the blue sky, or rather, I was standing around with my hands in my pockets while Ernie smoked a Lucky Strike in his back garden, more weeds than garden. And we noticed an injured orange and white kitten among the foxgloves by the train tracks. Its hind leg had been badly bitten by something. It was still bleeding, and the little thing could hardly hobble. Ernie ran into the house for life-saving supplies and returned with his mother's best tea towel. "Cats are the best mouse traps in the business," Ernie said, as he wrapped the damaged kitten in the soft white linen, securing it with adhesive tape from their medicine cabinet. "We need to nurse this little guy back to health and keep him," Ernie added with complete optimism. Carefully, he carried it inside and up to his room, and the exhausted mewling kitten spent the next few hours on Ernie's bed. I was still there when Ernie's stepdad, shirtless in a sleeveless vest, appeared in the doorway and went ballistic that Ernie was harboring such a rabid, filthy thing. I'm not proud to say that I chose that moment to head for home. At school the next day, Ernie slid into his seat, his right eye swollen, almost closed, the white streaked with blood. The teacher walked between the desks to take a closer look and said, "Castle, Frank, off to the nurse." Head down, nostrils flaring, Ernie didn't budge from his seat. The class fell silent, and we all felt his shame. The teacher put his fists on his hips, raised his voice, and insisted, "Please go to the infirmary. It's possible you need a stitch or two or at least an ice pack. Ernie glared up at him silently for a few long seconds, then grabbed his rucksack, stood, and made for the door. Arthur, go with him, the teacher ordered, and I scraped my chair back and followed Ernie into the corridor. His gait was off, as though his vision had also been affected. I wondered what the nurse would think. Her usual job was to comb our hair in search of nits or deal with a student who had a stomachache. Ernie turned his head just before he entered the nurse's office and said, "My stepfather hit me with the belt buckle after the kitten stained my pillow. He got me in the nose and it bled like a stuffed pig." I smeared the blood on his vest. His fist came next. That he was talking about it at all was a sign that the beating had been much worse than usual. Ernie went in and closed the door behind him, leaving me leaning against the wall outside the tiny room. His stepfather's sterling belt buckle, passed down from his own father, was inscribed, "England's First Glory." After he'd hit Ernie with the belt for the first time, we nicknamed it the First Gory. I hadn't escaped out the kitchen door fast enough during one such confrontation, and I'd heard his stepdad say, "I'm not hitting you, Ernie, I'm hitting the devil inside you." Ernie emerged from the nurse's office 15 minutes later in an overpowering waft of witch hazel, spearmint, and mercurochrome, which took me straight back to scraped knees when I was a little kid. My mother might have given me a slap on the backside every now and then, bawled me out on occasion, but no one had ever raised a violent hand to me. And so it was something of a mystery to see triumph written across Ernie's face, or maybe it was self-satisfaction or even glee. "Later," he said by way of an explanation, tipping his head towards his bag, which now seemed overstuffed. When we returned to the classroom, the teacher, reacting to whatever that look was on Ernie's face, immediately called upon him to report on his English homework. My heart sank. What with the kitten and the stepdad's blows, surely he hadn't been able to complete the essay. Ernie gave me the tiniest wink from his good eye, walked to the front of the class, and recited from memory Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. He delivered the lengthy poem, complete with quiet despair and darkest foreboding, made grislier by the state of his bashed up face, and we hung on his every inflection. After he whispered, "Nevermore," all of us leaning forward to hear it, he returned to his seat, the only sound in the room, the swish-swash of his brown corduroy trousers. A tinge of respect in his tone, the teacher said, "Finely wrought, Castle Frank, finely wrought." Then he glanced down at his ledger and up at Ernie. "For a passing grade, you'll still need to hand in your homework. I'll give you 2 more days." The bell rang and we were dismissed. Ernie sprang from his desk, grabbed his bag, and bolted from the room, me on his heels. We left the school grounds at a dead run, stopping, finally, at the cemetery on Austin Road. Winded, we threw ourselves down on the grass and then rolled over onto our backs to stare at the billowy clouds moving across a charcoal sky. From his rucksack, he pulled out a satin-edged red wool blanket and once again gave me that look of satisfaction. "Stole this from the sick bay." At first, I couldn't fathom that Ernie would steal from the concerned nurse, the only staff member who was universally loved. But all I could think of was that each little act of defiance was a way to hold ground. "Don't look so fussed, I'll bring it back." And then he added, "My stepfather tried to dispose of the kitten before it was dead. In the garden waste?" "The kitten died?" I asked. Ernie nodded. "I snuck out and brought it back to my room while it was still breathing. I don't know when it died, but it released its bodily fluids on my bed. I buried it by the tracks before I came to school this morning." We focused our eyes on a dozen quaking aspen trembling in the breeze, creating ripples of liquid gold. Ernie said, "Did you know if the leaves of an aspen can't move, they get eaten by insects, predators?" We listened to the quiver of a million shimmering yellow leaves. Then Ernie said, "They're like brothers, the way the trees stand by each other." I pushed myself up on an elbow. "That kitten must have become separated from the litter, or his mother gave up on him for being the runt, not enough milk. We can make a marker for its grave." There were more than a dozen little sites marked by ice lolly sticks in the grassy banks closest to the tracks. All the animals Ernie had fostered and buried. Ernie said,
The runt is always ridiculously happy to be alive. If they're loved, they catch up. But I couldn't save it. I was too late. He fell silent and closed his eyes, likely for the first time in more than 24 hours. Delicate blue veins were thin streaks on his milky lids. He was impossibly small and undernourished, ungroomed, weak blonde curls growing in again after the savage scalping he'd given himself weeks earlier, his childlike ribcage moving up and down. In that moment, he was as defenseless as the orange kitten, and I had to stop looking. I lay back down and faced the sky. There we were, far from what hurt us, being comforted by a brotherhood of trees. Thank you.
Okay.
I was just thinking about how these subject matters do kind of stay in the shadows. We talked about that earlier, you and I.
Yeah.
Although more recently there's more openness to speaking up about trauma and mental illness. But how do you, when you're writing a book, this is what you're thinking about all the time. And how do you live with these subject matters daily? Is it something that's a burden for you, or is it almost freeing because you're staring right at it and you're dealing directly with this material?
Well, I would say that the more interviews that I had, the more research material that I gathered, I was kind of writing the story for them as much as I was writing it for myself. There came a time where I couldn't stop, I couldn't turn back, because so many people had given me their stories with such intimate details and what had happened to them. And the more material I got, the more creative I became in terms of writing the story. But did I have a few nightmares writing this? Mostly because, you spend 3 years writing a book and doing, I did so much research. Well, if you read it, you'll see all the research that I did for the dark web, because I didn't know anything about that. So I worked really, really hard to get all that IT stuff straightened away. But, of course, your biggest worry as a writer is anybody going to read my work? Is it going to matter? And at the end of the day, even if this book is just for the people that I interviewed so that they could tell their stories and be honest, at the end of the day, it was worth it.
We have a question from the audience. And feel free to, you don't need to divulge, but is this something that you have personal experience with? Is that how you take on these subject matters? Or is it more so something that is curious, is flying around, or hits you in some way, and then you decide to pursue it?
Okay, well, I'm going to be very brave here. So I grew up in the suburbs of Montreal, in Beaconsfield, and there was a shopping mall in Pointe-Claire called Fairview. And I was in grade 6. I was 11, but I was very, very small. I probably looked 7 or 8. I was at the Fairview Mall with my 2 best friends, Donna and Amy, and we went into the Simpsons department store, and we went into the elevator, 2 floors, and a man got in, and he shut the elevator door, and he pushed the emergency buttons, and we couldn't get out, and he masturbated on my legs. And then when the door finally did open, the 3 of us ran out of the elevator as fast as we could, and we came to a Kodak counter. And there were 2 people at the Kodak counter. And to the best of our abilities, we tried to describe what had happened. Nobody asked us our names. Nobody called our mothers, and we were sent home. So these were the takeaways for me personally. It didn't become a trauma for me because it was a one-off situation. But what I took away and brought into my book is how easy it is to groom and manipulate children who have no context for the situation. I thought the man was sick. I did not know that it was a sexual experience. So that takeaway of how easy it is to manipulate young children, it only becomes
a horrible thing for a child when they're drawn into secrecy and when they're drawn into, if you tell anybody, this terrible, horrible thing is going to happen to you. So, but then to the second part of that question is, I was at a sports day, and there was a little 7-year-old boy who took a bite out of another child's cheek at a running race. And this boy who did the biting was referred to a child psychiatrist, and the report came back that he'd been sexually abused, emotionally abused, physically abused. And I knew the mom. I mean, apple pie and picket fences would come to mind. She was the nicest person you could ever meet. So at first I thought, liar, liar, pants on fire, what's going on? But it was revealed much later on that it wasn't a family member. It was somebody else. And so that story really stayed with me, that that boy in a way was lucky that he bit someone and then he had the school advocating on his behalf, because he may not have ever had the language to speak up, and who knows what damage it might have inflicted going forward for the rest of his life. So he's pretty good, that boy, now. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking.
Okay, here we go. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I think that is a really important part of these processes.
Yeah.
And it's ubiquitous. Like, as soon as you do start to talk about it, you make people around you feel warm enough to say, oh my gosh, me too. And that's part of this healing process.
The two main characters are men, and I purposefully chose to write about men because women we have more resources and we have more friendships and we're better communicators. Whereas men, they're defined by their jobs or lots of different things, but it's harder for men to talk about something like this. And so every book launch that I've done so far, since the book came out a month ago, somebody has whispered in my ear, that happened to me, or my brother, or my cousin. So, hopefully the book is readable and a good enough story that I can sort of hide these darker themes in an interesting story. That was my Colson Whitehead, is to write a really good story where you're turning the pages and trying to figure out what's going to happen. And oh, by the way, these are the themes that I'm talking about. So that was my goal in terms of writing the book. Make it a really character-driven book. And I hope you love Ernie and Arthur. That's my goal.
That's great. I think we have another audience question.
So I worked in psychiatry for 32 years with children, aged 12 to 18. And so we dealt with a lot of sexual abuse and those kind of things. And just to like some stories briefly, I don't want to elaborate too much, but we had one child, for an example, who the kids would take him to the bathroom and force him to do anal sex, that kind of stuff. This child became psychotic and landed up in our facility. And it took him probably a good year before he finally disclosed what was happening. And we began to do treatment on him. But for the longest time, we didn't understand what was happening. We had other kids, who were abused and then they'd go AWOL and be promiscuous on the street, because they found a way of making money,
Right.
We had other kids who were incest, those kind of things, one child was, wore layers and layers of clothes, because
That's in my book too, the layers of clothes.
Layers of clothes, because again, trying to mask who she is and trying to look ugly, so people wouldn't take advantage of her.
Yeah.
In your experience as an author and doing all of these interviews, was it difficult for those people to open up to you? Because sometimes it's all about building trust. before they start to disclose. And it takes a while to do that.
I was blown away by how much they shared. Almost all of my interviews were done on the phone, and there is a safety thing with the phone. And they couldn't see, the shock look on my face sometimes. But I had multiple interviews with everybody, and it was staggering how much detail they were sharing. Now, the thing is, when I sort of put it out there that I was looking for people to interview, I really was interviewing the men who were emancipated, the men who had come forward. There was nobody in my group of people that I interviewed who I was the very first person that they shared it with. I was already speaking to men who had willingly come forward. But that is a good question.
Did you speak with kids as well who were, or mostly all adults?
All adults. All adults, because I was really looking at the trajectory from the injured child to can you be an adult free from addiction and divorce and suicidal ideation. And that was kind of my mission, was to look at the trajectory. Yeah, thank you for the question.
I have one more comment and then we can wrap it up. I was really intrigued in your presentation when you spoke of somebody who called his abusive relationship the love of his life, or love.
Yes.
And therefore, what conclusions can we draw about love if like certain people are convinced that feeling is love, or they conflate the two? And so do you have any thoughts about
Well, yeah, it's
that?
funny. I'll just call him George, just for the sake of it. I remember George telling me about this relationship that he had with this nun, and he said, I loved her so much, and she loved me so much. And it went on for several years, and I can't even remember now how it ended, but he saw it as an absolute love relationship, whereas she, as a 42-year-old, clearly she had crossed the boundaries of what was appropriate. And then for the rest of his life, he was 70 when I interviewed him. He was just a sex addict. That was the fallout for him. A lovely, lovely man, has a great job and a great family, and but he has this addiction. But yes, he did love that nun. Yeah, so that's a very good question, is to think of how easily little children can be brought into the love aspect of it. I love you so much, you're so special, your grooming is insidious. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, do we have one more question, or we actually do? Okay.
I'm not really great. Okay, if that's okay. Yeah, the question would be regarding this gentleman's comments with the children who would take a long time to say something. My comment would be sort of folded into my other question, which is the children who take a long time, do you think, or in your experience interviewing people as the author, was there an aspect of that they're just simply not believed the way society is with, police and teachers and, the school system in a way is kind of a bit of a parallel with church. I heard one young person tell me about predatory teachers, and they said, of course, teachers, people who become teachers, it's like a buffet of children, right? That's what and this is from a child. And so pardon me if I struggle with making a question here, but did you encounter reprisal for people who were coming forward with some of their stories? To any of your characters, which I'm going to get this in the library, have an angle where they have come forward and then
not been believed,
and that not only not believed, but it's like double down on attacks and like things that venture into criminal harassment. Like, were any of the characters, and people you interviewed, when they report these things, do other people sort of gang up on
Well, I don't really know how to answer that question other than from what I heard from the people I interviewed, the mothers, most of the mothers did not come forward to corroborate or help out or go to the police. And at first I was like, wow, I was really shocked by that. But the mothers said to me, my child has been damaged and hurt during the grooming process and the abuse. To have to go to the courts, to have to go to the police station, to have to see a social worker and tell the whole story, it's going to be another way of putting my child through the ringer. So I had a number of mothers say I did not advocate for my child because I was afraid of them, being.
Things getting worse.
Pardon?
Things getting worse for the child.
Yeah, things getting worse for them.
Did you run into any that did advocate and then things got worse for them for having been the advocate?
Just thinking here, I don't think so. I don't think so. Because really and truly, it was men who were in there between the ages of 30 and 70 who'd had, some kind of abusive situation. And it certainly wasn't all the Catholic Church. Like I was telling my friends, Remy and Jenny today, that the reason I chose to hang my hat on the Catholic Church instead of the Boy Scouts or Hollywood or wherever is because I'm affronted by the hypocrisy of homosexuality. I just find that is, and there are many Catholic priests who are in homosexual relationships and yay, fantastic, I approve. But it's the hypocrisy of shunning homosexuals within their ranks. So that's why I have my hat there. But a lot of the interviews that I did were not just at the hands of priests. It was, that's why I made a point of saying this very famous theater company in Minnesota and a boys camp. And then that little boy who took a bite, he was at a private school. And I mean, and I feel like I did a bit of a disservice by just honing in on the Catholic Church, but I had to hang my hat somewhere.
Yeah, and I would think that people who are experienced with this know that it's transferable to other venues.
Yes. I hope people do realize that.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I hope
Thank
there was a
you.
question
No,
there.
I appreciate it. It's good too that we can have a little bit of back and forth and an open conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you for sharing what
It's
you learned.
definitely something that needs to be talked about.
That's right. You can see you have like a lot of curiosity about it.
People don't even crack open the book. That's my biggest worry. But whoever reads it, hopefully it will speak to the people who do choose to read it and gets into the right hands. That's my hope.
I think that's a perfect place to stop.
So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you,
Really,
Susan. We appreciate you for being here tonight, for the people watching from home, to Random House for publishing the book and hosting us tonight as well. So we will do a signing right here. Feel free to pick up a copy, get it signed. Please remember to pay for it on your way out. That's all we ask. And yeah, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you again, Susan.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for
good evening.
coming. I think I've already signed everybody's book.
For library people, And I heard you mention audio.
Oh yeah, if you have Spotify, you can listen to the